In the darkness before dawn, when the world sleeps and time seems to pause, we journey back through millennia to a place where civilization first drew breath. Tonight, let yourself drift into the ancient world of Sumer, where the very foundations of human society were laid in mud and ambition. There's no need to hurry, no need to remember every detail. Simply let the story unfold as it will, and forget about time itself. The marshlands of southern Mesopotamia hold secrets that predate the pyramids, mysteries that emerged when writing was born, and cities first cast shadows across the earth. Here, in this cradle between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people who called themselves the Black-Headed Ones built something unprecedented in human history. Their story spans 35 centuries, longer than any empire that followed, and tonight we'll walk through their world at the pace of centuries, watching empires rise and fall like seasons changing. Settle back, breathe deeply, and prepare to witness the birth of everything we recognize as civilization. The Sumerians await, with their towering ziggurats, their complex gods, and their all-too-human struggles for power, love, and immortality. Around 4500 BCE, when much of Europe remained cloaked in forest and populated by scattered hunters, something extraordinary was stirring in the marshy deltas of Mesopotamia. Small groups of people, whose origins remain one of archaeology's most intriguing puzzles, began to coalesce around permanent settlements. These weren't the first farmers the world had seen, but they possessed something different, an almost obsessive drive to organize, to systematize, to create order from the chaos of river floods and seasonal uncertainty. The earlier settlements appeared like islands in a sea of reeds and channels. Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves considered the first city ever built, rose from the marshy ground around 5400 BCE. According to their own creation stories, Eridu was where the god Enki first stepped onto dry land and established divine order. But the archaeological reality was more prosaic and perhaps more remarkable. Here, ordinary people began the slow process of transforming mud into bricks, transforming temporary camps into permanent homes, and transforming subsistence into surplus. The landscape itself shaped these early Sumerians. The southern Mesopotamian plain was a place of extremes, devastating floods followed by parching drought, fertile alluvium deposited by rivers that could change course without warning. There were no mountains to provide stone, no forests to offer timber. Everything had to be made from what the rivers brought: clay, reeds, and the occasional bit of bitumen that seeped from the earth. This scarcity bred innovation and an almost alchemical ability to transform the humblest materials into the building blocks of civilization. By 4000 BCE, the settlement pattern had crystallized into something recognizable. Small communities clustered around temple complexes, each dedicated to a particular deity who was believed to own the surrounding land. These weren't the simple shrines of earlier peoples, but elaborate architectural statements built from sun-dried bricks and decorated with intricate mosaic patterns made from coloured clay cones. The temples served as economic centres, storehouses and workshops, but they were also something more profound, attempts to create a physical bridge between the human and divine worlds. The people who built these early temples left behind tantalising clues about their daily lives: clay figurines of worshippers, their hands clasped in eternal prayer, their eyes wide with ceramic devotion. Cylinder seals that, when rolled across wet clay, left intricate scenes of gods and monsters, priests and kings. And most remarkably, the earliest experiments in writing, not yet the cuneiform script that would become famous, but simple pictographs pressed into clay to record offerings to the gods and transactions in the temple storehouses. These Proto-Sumerians were developing something that had never existed before: systematic record-keeping. Every jar of oil, every measure of barley, every day's work in the fields was being tracked and tallied. The implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, economic activity was being abstracted, turned into symbols that could be manipulated independently of the physical goods they represented. The foundations of mathematics, accounting, and ultimately complex government were being laid in the mud of ancient temple courtyards. The transition from these early settlements to true city-states was neither sudden nor uniform. Different communities developed at different paces, influenced by local conditions, the personalities of their leaders, and what we might now call historical accident. But by 3500 BCE, a recognizable pattern had emerged across the Mesopotamian landscape. dozens of independent city-states, each controlling its surrounding agricultural land, each dominated by a massive temple complex that served as the focal point of religious, economic and political life. Uruk emerged as the largest and most influential of these early cities. By 3200 BCE, it may have housed as many as 50,000 people, making it the largest human settlement that had ever existed. The city sprawled across nearly 3 square miles, its mud brick houses and narrow streets enclosed by massive walls. At its heart rose the White Temple, built on a platform that elevated it high above the surrounding buildings, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the desert sun like a man-made mountain. But Uruk was more than just large. It was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. Archaeological excavations have revealed specialized craft quarters where artisans worked full-time producing pottery, textiles, and metal goods. There were residential districts arranged by social class, with the largest and most elaborate houses near the temple district and smaller, more cramped dwellings toward the city's edges. Most remarkably, there were clear signs of intensive administrative activity, rooms full of clay tablets covered with early cuneiform writing, evidence of a bureaucracy that tracked everything from livestock inventories to work gang assignments. The development of writing at Uruk around 3200 BCE represents one of humanity's great intellectual leaps. The earliest tablets are frustratingly mundane, lists of commodities, records of payments, inventories of temple property. But embedded in these prosaic documents is evidence of minds grappling with abstract concepts that we take for granted. The idea that a symbol can represent a word, that transactions can be recorded and verified later, that complex information can be stored outside human memory. The scribes who developed cuneiform writing were solving practical problems, but they were also creating the possibility of history itself. Before writing, human knowledge was limited to what could be remembered and passed down orally. With the advent of writing, information could accumulate across generations. Laws could be codified, stories could be preserved exactly, and the experiences of one generation could be transmitted intact to another. These early Sumerian cities were strange places by modern standards, neither purely secular nor purely religious, but something for which we lack adequate terminology. The temple dominated not just the city's skyline, but its entire economy. The god was considered the literal owner of the city and its surrounding territory, with the human inhabitants serving as tenants or sharecroppers. The Ensi, or city ruler, functioned as the god's earthly steward, responsible for maintaining the divine property and ensuring the god's continued favour. This system created a unique form of early socialism, though the Sumerians would not have recognised the term. Large portions of the population worked directly for the temple, receiving rations of food, clothing, and other necessities in return for their labour. Massive public works projects, the construction and maintenance of irrigation canals, the building of temples and walls, the organisation of agricultural labour, were carried out by these temple workers under the direction of a growing bureaucracy of priests and administrators. Yet this was not a totalitarian system in the modern sense. Private property existed alongside temple holdings. Independent merchants and craftsmen operated their own businesses. Families owned houses and small plots of land. The temple system provided a backbone of stability and organisation, but it left room for individual initiative and private enterprise. It was, in many ways, a remarkably sophisticated mixed economy, balancing collective needs with individual freedoms in ways that wouldn't be seen again for millennia. The agricultural foundation of Sumerian civilization was itself a marvel of engineering and organisation. The rivers of Mesopotamia were both blessing and curse. They provided the water essential for farming in an arid land, but their floods were unpredictable and often destructive. The Sumerians responded by developing the world's first large-scale irrigation systems, networks of canals, dikes and reservoirs that captured floodwater and distributed it across thousands of acres of cultivated land. Managing these irrigation systems required unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. Canals had to be dug and maintained by workers from multiple communities. Water rights had to be negotiated and enforced. Conflicts over water access had to be resolved before they escalated into warfare. The irrigation systems, in many ways, created the necessity for government itself. Some authority had to exist to coordinate these massive collective efforts. The agricultural surplus produced by irrigation agriculture was the foundation upon which all Sumerian achievements rested. Freed from the immediate necessity of food production, some members of society could specialize in other activities: craftsmanship, trade, religious ritual, military service, and administration. This specialization, in turn, created the need for more sophisticated systems of exchange and record-keeping, driving further innovations in mathematics, writing, and social organization. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerian city-states had developed most of the institutions that we associate with civilization: monumental architecture, writing systems, specialized crafts, long-distance trade, formal religious hierarchies, and complex government bureaucracies. But they had also developed something else, something darker and more familiar to modern observers: organized warfare. The earliest Sumerian art is filled with images of battle, not the spontaneous violence of raiding parties or tribal conflicts, but systematic military campaigns conducted by organized armies, equipped with specialized weapons and led by professional commanders. The Standard of Ur, one of the most famous artifacts from early Mesopotamia, depicts on one side the horrors of war: rows of soldiers trampling fallen enemies, chariots rolling over scattered bodies, and on the other side the celebration of victory, with captive enemies being led before the king while priests pour libations to the gods. War in early Sumer was not simply a matter of one city conquering another. It was embedded in a complex system of religious and political beliefs that saw conflict as a continuation of cosmic struggles between the gods themselves. When the city of Umma fought against Lagash, it wasn't merely a dispute over water rights or territorial boundaries. It was understood as a manifestation of a disagreement between their patron deities Shara and Ningirsu. Victory in battle was proof of divine favour. Defeat was evidence of divine displeasure. This religious understanding of warfare gave Sumerian conflicts a total quality that was both destructive and paradoxically limited. Cities might be conquered and their populations enslaved, but they were rarely destroyed completely. The victorious god still needed worshippers, and the victorious city still needed farmers to work the land. Conquest meant the replacement of one ruling dynasty with another, the redirection of tribute from one temple to another, but not the annihilation of entire populations. The weapons and tactics of early Sumerian warfare were sophisticated for their time. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sumerian armies used bronze-tipped spears, leather shields reinforced with bronze studs, and primitive chariots pulled by domesticated donkeys. Infantry fought in tight formations, with spearmen protected by shield-bearers, while archers provided covering fire from behind the main battle line. It was methodical, organised violence, warfare as an extension of the same bureaucratic mentality that governed temple administration and irrigation management. The period between 2900 and 2334 BCE represents the classical age of Sumerian city-state civilization. During these 6 centuries, the basic pattern of Mesopotamian political life was established. Independent cities competing for dominance, periodic wars followed by peace treaties, the rise and fall of hegemonies that united several cities under a single ruler, and the constant struggle to balance local autonomy with regional stability. The earliest historically attested rulers of this period are shadowy figures known primarily from later legend and the occasional contemporary inscription. Meskiagasha of Uruk, who may have lived around 2700 BCE, is credited with founding the first Sumerian dynasty and expanding Uruk's influence from the mountains to the sea. His son Enmerkar supposedly built the walls of Uruk and engaged in epic contest with the rulers of distant Aratta, wherever that may have been. Lugalbanda, another early king of Uruk, became the hero of epic poems that celebrated his supernatural strength and divine connections. These early rulers exist at the intersection of history and mythology, real people whose actual achievements have been embellished and transformed by generations of storytellers and scribes. But they represent something important: the emergence of individual personality in history, the idea that single human beings could shape the destiny of entire civilizations through their actions and decisions. The most famous of these early rulers, though he may have lived somewhat later, was Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and hero of humanity's oldest known work of literature. The historical Gilgamesh probably ruled around 2700 BCE and may have been responsible for rebuilding Uruk's walls and expanding the city's influence. But the Gilgamesh we know from the epic poems is a larger-than-life figure who wrestled with gods. befriended wild men, and journeyed to the ends of the earth in search of immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its various versions, preserves something precious: the voice of the Sumerians themselves, their concerns and fears, their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world governed by unpredictable gods and inevitable death. Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu, his grief at Enkidu's death, his desperate quest for eternal life, and his ultimate acceptance of mortality speak to universal human experiences in a way that transcends the 3 millennia separating us from ancient Sumer. But the epic also reveals distinctly Sumerian preoccupations: the relationship between civilization and wildness, the responsibilities of kingship, the proper balance between human ambition and divine will. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu cut down the sacred cedar forest, they are violating the boundary between the human and natural worlds. When Gilgamesh spurns the goddess Ishtar, he is refusing to accept the proper relationship between mortal rulers and divine authority. The epic is, in many ways, a meditation on the costs and benefits of civilization itself. The archaeological record from this period reveals a society of increasing sophistication and complexity. Sumerian artisans were producing works of extraordinary beauty and technical skill. The golden helmet of Meskelamdug from the royal cemetery at Ur, the intricate inlays of the standard of Gur, the delicate metalwork found in the tomb of Queen Puabi. These weren't just luxury items, but technological marvels that required advanced knowledge of metallurgy, woodworking, and textile production. Trade networks extended far beyond Mesopotamia itself. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia, and carnelian from India flowed into Sumerian cities, where they were transformed into finished goods and re-exported throughout the ancient world. Sumerian merchants established trading posts in distant lands, while foreign merchants set up shops in Sumerian marketplaces. The early global economy was taking shape, with Sumer at its centre. The social structure of classical Sumerian society was complex and stratified. At the top stood the Lugal, or Ensi, the city ruler who served as both political leader and chief priest. Below him was a hierarchy of priests, administrators, and military officers, followed by merchants, skilled craftsmen, and farmers. At the bottom were slaves, prisoners of war, and debt servants who had lost their freedom through economic misfortune. But this hierarchy was more fluid than it might appear. Successful merchants could buy their way into the administrative class. Skilled craftsmen could accumulate enough wealth to purchase land and slaves of their own. Even slaves could sometimes earn or purchase their freedom and establish themselves as independent producers. Social mobility, while limited, was possible in ways that would become much more restricted in later periods. Women in early Sumerian society occupied a complex position that defies easy generalization. Some women, particularly those associated with temple service, wielded considerable power and authority. The Entu, or high priestesses, controlled substantial temple properties and participated in important religious ceremonies. Royal women like Queen Puabi were buried with elaborate grave goods that suggest they held significant status in their own right, not merely as wives or mothers of male rulers. But ordinary women faced significant legal and social restrictions. They could own property, engage in business, and initiate divorce proceedings, but their legal capacity was generally subordinate to that of their male relatives. The tension between individual women's achievements and systemic gender inequality was a characteristic feature of Sumerian society that would persist throughout Mesopotamian history. The religious life of the Sumerians was extraordinarily rich and complex, involving hundreds of deities arranged in elaborate hierarchies that mirrored earthly political structures. At the head of the pantheon stood An, the god of heaven, but effective power was often wielded by younger, more active deities like Enlil, god of wind and storm, and Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Each city had its own patron deity, who was considered the literal owner of the city and its territory. Sumerian temples were not places of congregational worship in the modern sense, but rather earthly households of the gods. The divine statue was treated as a living being, awakened each morning, fed regular meals, entertained with music and dance, and put to bed each evening. Ordinary people participated in religious festivals and processions, but the daily care of the gods was the responsibility of a professional priesthood that functioned as the gods' earthly servants. The Sumerian understanding of the afterlife was notably gloomy. The dead were believed to descend to the underworld, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, where they existed as pale shadows of their former selves, dependent on offerings from the living for sustenance. This bleak vision of death gave Sumerian religion an urgency and poignancy that permeates their literature and art. Since there was no hope of a blessed afterlife, meaning and fulfillment had to be found in this world, in the accomplishment of great deeds that would be remembered after death. Magic and divination played important roles in Sumerian religious practice. Priests interpreted omens found in the livers of sacrificed animals, the flight patterns of birds, the movements of celestial bodies, and the shapes of oil drops on water. Every aspect of life, from military campaigns to commercial ventures to personal relationships, was subject to supernatural influence that could be predicted and to some extent manipulated through proper ritual procedures. The legal system of the Sumerians was remarkably sophisticated, based on written law codes that attempted to regulate every aspect of social and economic life. The earliest known law code, promulgated by Ur-Nammu of Ur around 2100 BCE, established penalties for various crimes and procedures for resolving disputes. These laws were not divinely revealed commandments, but practical regulations designed to maintain social order and protect property rights. Sumerian law recognized the principle of proportional punishment. The penalty should fit the crime, but it also recognized the reality of social stratification. Crimes against nobles were punished more severely than the same crimes against commoners, and the testimony of higher status individuals carried more weight in legal proceedings. The law protected private property and commercial contracts, but it also provided some protection for the poor and disadvantaged through regulations on debt and slavery. Legal proceedings were conducted before judges who were appointed by the city ruler and advised by councils of elders. Evidence was presented, witnesses were examined, and oaths were administered in the name of the gods. The Sumerians believed that the gods would punish perjury, so oaths were taken seriously, and false testimony was considered not just a legal offence, but a religious sin. The economic foundations of Sumerian civilization rested on a complex mixture of temple socialism, private enterprise, and royal redistribution. Large portions of the population worked directly for the temples, receiving rations of food, clothing, and other necessities in return for their labour. These temple workers included farmers who cultivated the god's land, craftsmen who produced goods in temple workshops, and labourers who built and maintained public works. But alongside the temple economy was a vigorous private sector. Independent farmers owned their own land and sold their surplus in local markets. Merchants organised trading expeditions to distant lands, financing their ventures through partnerships and loans. Craftsmen produced goods for sale to private customers as well as for temple commissions. The relationship between public and private sectors was complementary rather than competitive. The Sumerians developed sophisticated financial instruments to facilitate trade and investment. Contracts for partnerships, loans, and land sales were recorded on clay tablets and sealed with the personal seals of the parties involved. Interest rates were regulated, and procedures existed for resolving commercial disputes. Banking, in a primitive form, emerged as temples and wealthy individuals provided loans to merchants and farmers. Agricultural production was intensified through increasingly sophisticated irrigation systems. Networks of canals, each requiring constant maintenance and careful water management, distributed river water across hundreds of thousands of acres of cultivated land. The main crops were barley and wheat, but farmers also grew dates, vegetables, and legumes. Livestock, including cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, provided meat, milk, and materials for clothing and tools. Craft production reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Sumerian metalworkers were producing complex alloys and intricate decorative objects. Textile workers created fine fabrics dyed in brilliant colours. Potters made everything from simple storage jars to elaborate ceremonial vessels. The standardization of weights and measures facilitated trade, while innovations in technology, the potter's wheel, the plough, the sail, increased productivity and efficiency. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian civilization had reached a mature form that would influence all subsequent developments in Mesopotamian history. The basic institutions, city-states, temple economies, written law, professional armies, long-distance trade, were all in place. The cultural achievements, literature, art, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, had established patterns that would endure for millennia. But this classical period was also marked by increasing political instability and military conflict. As the individual city-states grew in power and wealth, they inevitably came into conflict with one another over water rights, trade routes, and territorial boundaries. The delicate balance between local autonomy and regional cooperation began to break down, leading to a series of wars that would fundamentally transform Sumerian society. The conflict between Lagash and Umma, which dominated much of the 25th century BCE, illustrates both the causes and consequences of intercity warfare in classical Sumer. The two cities were located close to one another in the southeastern part of the Mesopotamian plain, and they shared access to important irrigation canals fed by the Tigris River. As both cities grew and their agricultural needs increased, disputes over water allocation became increasingly frequent and bitter. The earliest recorded phase of this conflict occurred during the reign of Eannatum of Lagash, around 2450 BCE. According to inscriptions left by Eannatum, the dispute began when Umma encroached on territory that rightfully belonged to Lagash. The god Ningirsu, patron of Lagash, appeared to Eannatum in a dream and commanded him to recover the stolen land. The resulting battle was depicted on the famous stele of the vultures, which shows Eannatum leading his troops into battle while vultures feast on the corpses of his enemies. But military victory did not resolve the underlying issues. The boundary between the two cities remained disputed, water rights continued to be contested, and periodic warfare resumed whenever diplomatic solutions broke down. The conflict persisted for more than a century, draining the resources of both cities and creating opportunities for external enemies to exploit their weakness. The administrative records from Lagash during this period provide extraordinary detail about how a Sumerian city-state functioned during wartime. We can track the mobilization of troops, the stockpiling of weapons and supplies, the negotiation of military alliances, and the celebration of victories. We can also see the costs of constant warfare, disrupted trade, damaged irrigation systems, and the diversion of labour from productive activities to military service. One of the most remarkable rulers of this period was Urukagina of Lagash, who came to power around 2350 BCE and attempted to implement sweeping social and economic reforms. According to his own inscriptions, Urukagina freed the citizens of Lagash from the oppressive taxes and forced labour that had been imposed by previous rulers. He eliminated corrupt officials, protected the rights of widows and orphans, and proclaimed that the god Ningirsu, not the earthly king, was the true ruler of the city. Urukagina's reforms were motivated partly by religious conviction. He claimed to be restoring the divine order that had been corrupted by human greed, and partly by political necessity. The long war with Umma had strained Lagash's resources to the breaking point, and social unrest was threatening the stability of the state. By positioning himself as a reformer and protector of the common people, Urukagina hoped to restore unity and strengthen his city for the continuing struggle with its enemies. The reforms were short-lived. Within a few years, Lagash was conquered by Lugalzagesi of Umma, who had built a coalition of Sumerian cities under his leadership. Urukagina's attempt to create a more just society was crushed by the harsh realities of interstate competition and military power, but his reforms were remembered, and the principles he articulated — royal responsibility for justice, protection of the weak, limitation of arbitrary power — would reappear throughout Mesopotamian history. Lugalzagesi's conquest of Lagash was part of a larger transformation in Sumerian politics. By 2340 BCE, he had unified most of southern Mesopotamia under his rule, creating the first regional empire in human history. His capital was at Uruk, but his authority extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time, a single ruler controlled the entire network of Sumerian cities, ending the era of independent city-state competition. Lugalzagesi's empire represented both the culmination of Sumerian political development and its ultimate transformation. The city-states remained intact, but they were now subordinated to a higher authority. Local rulers continued to govern their territories, but they did so as representatives of the imperial king, rather than as independent sovereigns. The temples maintained their economic functions, but their political autonomy was curtailed. This imperial experiment was brief, but significant. It demonstrated that the Sumerian city-states could be unified under a single authority, that the benefits of unification, an end to destructive intercity warfare, coordinated management of water resources, expanded trade networks, outweighed the costs of lost independence. It also created administrative and military precedents that would be adopted and refined by subsequent imperial rulers. The daily life of ordinary Sumerians during this classical period was shaped by the rhythms of agricultural production, religious observance, and family obligation. Most people lived in small houses built around courtyards, with rooms for sleeping, cooking, storage, and work. Extended families often lived together, with grandparents, parents, and children sharing the same compound. Privacy was limited, and family solidarity was essential for economic survival and social security. Work began before dawn and continued until sunset, with a break during the hottest part of the day. Farmers tended their fields, maintained irrigation channels, and cared for livestock. Craftsmen worked in specialized shops, often grouped by trade in particular neighborhoods. Merchants traveled to distant markets or managed local establishments. Women managed households, raised children, and often participated in family businesses. The Sumerian diet was based on barley, which was consumed as bread or beer, and dates, which provided sweetness and could be stored for long periods. Vegetables, legumes, and dairy products supplemented these staples, while meat was reserved for special occasions and religious festivals. Beer was the standard beverage for all ages, since it was safer than water and provided important nutrients. Education was limited to a small elite, primarily the sons of wealthy families who were destined for careers in the priesthood, the bureaucracy, or commerce. Students learned to read and write cuneiform script by copying and memorizing literary texts, mathematical problems, and legal documents. The curriculum was demanding and the discipline harsh, but it provided access to the most prestigious and lucrative careers in Sumerian society. Marriage was typically arranged by families, with economic considerations playing a major role in the selection of partners. Brides brought dowries to their new households, while grooms provided bride prices to their future in-laws. Divorce was possible but complicated, requiring legal proceedings and the division of property. Children belonged to their father's family, and inheritance followed patrilineal lines, though women retained some rights to property and could sometimes pass wealth to their daughters. Religious observance permeated every aspect of daily life. Households maintained shrines to family gods and ancestors, while individuals wore amulets and participated in protective rituals designed to ward off evil influences. The calendar was organized around religious festivals, which provided opportunities for community celebration, social interaction, and commercial activity. Death was marked by elaborate funeral rituals that reflected the deceased's social status and the family's ability to pay for proper burial. The material culture of the Sumerians was remarkable for its combination of functionality and beauty. Even ordinary household objects, cooking pots, storage jars, furniture, tools, were often decorated with intricate patterns and designs. Personal ornaments, including jewelry, cosmetics, and clothing, allowed individuals to display their wealth and status while conforming to social expectations about appropriate dress and behavior. The collapse of Lugal-Sajizi's empire came suddenly and dramatically with the conquest of Mesopotamia by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE. Sargon was not a Sumerian, but a speaker of Akkadian, a Semitic language that had long been spoken alongside Sumerian in northern Mesopotamia. His conquest marked the beginning of a new era in which Sumerian culture would be preserved and transmitted by non-Sumerian rulers. The Akkadian period, lasting from 2334 to 2154 BCE, saw the creation of the world's first multi-ethnic empire. Sargon and his successors ruled over Sumerians, Akkadians, Elamites, and numerous other peoples, creating new forms of imperial administration and cultural synthesis. Sumerian remained the language of religion and learning, while Akkadian became the language of government and diplomacy. Under Akkadian rule, Sumerian civilization underwent both preservation and transformation. The old city-states maintained their local institutions and religious traditions, but they were now integrated into a much larger political and economic system. Trade networks expanded dramatically, carrying Mesopotamian goods and ideas to India, Central Asia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Akkadian kings commissioned Sumerian artists and scribes, ensuring the continuation of traditional cultural forms while adding new elements from other parts of their diverse empire. The most famous Akkadian ruler was Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who ruled from 2254 to 2218 BCE. Naram-Sin declared himself a god, having his divine status indicated by the horned crown traditionally worn only by deities in Mesopotamian art. This assertion of divine kingship went beyond traditional Sumerian concepts of rulership and reflected the influence of imperial ideology on local traditions. Naram-Sin's reign marked the height of Akkadian power, but it also saw the beginning of problems that would eventually destroy the empire. Rebellions in the Sumerian cities, invasions by mountain peoples from the east, and administrative difficulties in controlling such a vast territory all contributed to imperial decline. The final blow came around 2154 BCE when the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, conquered most of Mesopotamia and brought Akkadian rule to an end. The Gutian period, lasting from about 2154 to 2112 BCE, was remembered by later Mesopotamian historians as a time of darkness and barbarism. Contemporary sources are scarce, but they suggest that Gutian rule was harsh and exploitative, that trade networks were disrupted, and that many of the achievements of Akkadian civilization were lost or abandoned. The Sumerian cities maintained some autonomy under Gutian overlordship, but their prosperity and cultural creativity declined significantly. The liberation of Mesopotamia from Gutian rule came through the efforts of Utuhengel of Uruk, who defeated the Gutians around 2112 BCE and briefly restored native rule. But Utuhengel's triumph was short-lived. He was soon overthrown by Ur-Nammu, governor of Ur, who founded the third dynasty of Ur and inaugurated what historians call the Sumerian Renaissance. The third dynasty of Ur, lasting from 2112 to 2004 BCE, represented the final flowering of Sumerian civilization. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, particularly Shulgi, Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin, southern Mesopotamia experienced a remarkable revival of prosperity, cultural achievement, and political unity. This was the last time that native Sumerian rulers would control the Mesopotamian heartland, and they seem to have been conscious of their role as preservers and transmitters of ancient traditions. Ur-Nammu's law code, the earliest known legal document in history, established principles of justice and social order that drew explicitly on Sumerian precedents while addressing contemporary problems. The code proclaimed the king's responsibility to protect the weak, ensure fair weights and measures, and prevent the oppression of the poor by the powerful. These were not new ideas in Sumerian culture, but their formal codification represented an important step in the development of systematic jurisprudence. The administrative system developed by the third dynasty of Ur was extraordinarily sophisticated, involving detailed record-keeping that has provided modern historians with unprecedented insight into the functioning of an ancient state. Tens of thousands of clay tablets from this period document everything from the daily rations distributed to temple workers to the diplomatic correspondence between the kings of Ur and foreign rulers. We can track the movement of goods across the empire, follow the careers of individual officials, and observe the complex workings of a planned economy that controlled vast resources and employed hundreds of thousands of people. Under Shulgi, who ruled for 48 years from 2094 to 2047 BCE, the third dynasty of Ur reached its zenith. Shulgi was a patron of learning and the arts, a military conqueror who extended Ur's influence deep into Iran and Anatolia, and an administrative innovator who systematized government operations throughout his realm. He also claimed divine status, like the Akkadian kings before him, and was worshipped as a god during his lifetime and after his death. The capital city of Ur during this period was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Archaeological excavations have revealed massive temple complexes, elaborate royal palaces, well-planned residential districts, and sophisticated infrastructure including paved streets, drainage systems, and harbour facilities. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu and completed by Shulgi, rose in 3 stages to a height of more than 60 feet, topped by a temple dedicated to the moon god Nana. The ziggurat was more than just an impressive building. It was a cosmic symbol, representing the mountain where heaven and earth met and where the gods communicated with humanity. Its construction required the labour of thousands of workers over many years, and demonstrated both the wealth of the Ur state and its commitment to maintaining proper relationships with the divine world. The ziggurat served as the focal point for religious festivals that brought together people from throughout the empire, reinforcing both spiritual and political unity. But the third dynasty of Ur was always more fragile than its impressive monuments suggested. The empire was held together by a complex administrative system, that required constant attention and enormous resources to maintain. The standardized rations distributed to state workers, the massive construction projects, the large standing army, and the extensive bureaucracy all required a level of economic productivity that pushed the agricultural system to its limits. Environmental factors also played a crucial role in the dynasty's eventual decline. Intensive irrigation agriculture had been practiced in southern Mesopotamia for more than 1,000 years by this time, and the cumulative effects were beginning to show. Salinization of the soil, caused by the evaporation of irrigation water in the arid climate, was reducing crop yields in many areas. The siltation of canals required constant maintenance work that diverted labour from other activities. Climate change, including a period of reduced rainfall that began around 2200 BCE, made agriculture even more precarious. The final century of the Third Dynasty of Ur was marked by increasing military pressure from nomadic peoples, internal rebellions, and economic difficulties. The Amorites, Semitic-speaking nomads from the Syrian desert, began infiltrating Mesopotamia in large numbers, sometimes as peaceful migrants, but increasingly as raiders and conquerors. The last king of Ur, Ibisin, spent most of his 24-year reign fighting against internal and external enemies who gradually eroded his territory and resources. The end came around 2004 BCE, when a coalition of Elamites from Iran and Amorites from Syria captured Ur itself and carried Ibisin away into captivity. The fall of Ur marked the end of the last native Sumerian dynasty, and the beginning of a new era in which Mesopotamia would be ruled by peoples who spoke other languages and followed different cultural traditions. But Sumerian civilization did not disappear with the fall of the Third Dynasty of Ur. Sumerian language continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes, like Latin in medieval Europe. Sumerian literary works were copied and studied by scribes throughout Mesopotamia for another 1,000 years. Sumerian legal principles, religious concepts, and artistic traditions were absorbed and transformed by the Babylonians, Assyrians, and other peoples who succeeded to Mesopotamian power. The transition period following the fall of Ur, roughly from 2000 to 1800 BCE, saw the emergence of a new political pattern in Mesopotamia. Instead of a single unified empire, the region was divided among numerous small kingdoms ruled by Amorite dynasties. These rulers adopted Mesopotamian culture and administrative practices while maintaining their own ethnic identities and tribal loyalties. The result was a complex mosaic of states that competed with one another for dominance while sharing a common civilization. During this period, Sumerian cities like Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu maintained their religious significance even as political power shifted to new centers like Babylon, Mari, and Ashur. Sumerian temples continued to function, Sumerian festivals continued to be celebrated, and Sumerian gods continued to be worshipped. But increasingly these ancient traditions were interpreted and administered by non-Sumerian priests and officials. The religious tradition of Sumer proved to be one of its most enduring legacies. Sumerian creation myths, flood stories, and divine genealogies were adapted and retold by later Mesopotamian cultures and eventually influenced the religious traditions of Israel, Greece, and other Mediterranean peoples. The Epic of Gilgamesh was translated into numerous languages and spread throughout the ancient world, becoming one of humanity's first truly international literary works. Sumerian mathematical and astronomical achievements also had lasting impact. The sexagesimal number system, based on units of 60, continued to be used for mathematical and astronomical calculations throughout antiquity, and is still reflected in our division of hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. Sumerian observations of planetary movements and stellar positions formed the foundation for later Babylonian astronomy, which in turn influenced Greek and Islamic astronomical traditions. The technological innovations pioneered by the Sumerians, the wheel, the plough, the sailboat, bronze metallurgy, monumental architecture, spread throughout the ancient world and became fundamental components of human civilization. These were not just practical inventions, but conceptual breakthroughs that opened new possibilities for human activity and social organization. Perhaps most importantly, the Sumerians developed the basic institutions and concepts that we still associate with civilized life: written law, formal education, specialized government, professional armies, organized religion, and systematic record-keeping. These innovations made possible the complex societies that followed, from the Babylonian and Assyrian empires to the Persian and Hellenistic kingdoms to the Roman Empire and beyond. The Sumerian understanding of kingship, in particular, influenced political thought throughout the ancient world. Sumerian rulers were seen as divinely appointed stewards, responsible for maintaining justice, protecting the weak, and ensuring prosperity for their subjects. This concept of royal responsibility was adopted by later Mesopotamian, Persian, and Hellenistic rulers, and eventually influenced medieval European ideas about monarchy. The last centuries of Sumerian cultural influence coincided with the rise of Babylon as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Under Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE, Babylon established hegemony over most of the region and created legal and administrative systems that drew heavily on Sumerian precedents. Hammurabi's famous law code, while written in Akkadian, incorporated legal principles and procedures that had been developed in Sumerian cities centuries earlier. The Code of Hammurabi represented both the culmination of Mesopotamian legal development and its transformation. The Code's principle of proportional punishment, an eye for an eye, echoed similar principles in earlier Sumerian law codes, but Hammurabi's laws were more systematic and comprehensive than anything that had come before. The Code also reflected the social stratification of Babylonian society, with different penalties for the same crimes depending on the social status of the victims and perpetrators. Babylonian religion during this period was essentially a transformation of Sumerian religious tradition. The old Sumerian gods were still worshipped, but their names were often given Akkadian translations, and their roles were sometimes modified to fit new political and social circumstances. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, was elevated to the head of the pantheon, but his authority was legitimized through marriage to traditional Sumerian goddesses and adoption of traditional Sumerian divine prerogatives. The great literary works of Babylonian culture, the Enuma Elish creation epic, the Atrahasis flood story, the standard version of the Gilgamesh epic, were all reworkings of earlier Sumerian materials. These texts preserved Sumerian religious and philosophical ideas while adapting them to new cultural contexts. The result was a synthesis that maintained continuity with the past, while addressing contemporary concerns. By 1600 BCE, the political map of Mesopotamia had stabilized into a pattern that would persist for several centuries. Babylon controlled the southern region, including most of the old Sumerian heartland. Assyria dominated the north. Various smaller kingdoms held territory along the frontiers. This political fragmentation allowed for cultural diversity while maintaining the overall unity of Mesopotamian civilization. In the Sumerian cities themselves, daily life continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers still worked the ancient irrigation systems, craftsmen still produced goods using traditional techniques, and priests still performed rituals that dated back to the dawn of history. But the language of administration was now Akkadian. The ruling dynasties were Amorite, and the ultimate political authority lay with foreign kings. The preservation of Sumerian culture during this period was largely the work of scribes and priests who saw themselves as guardians of ancient wisdom. In temple schools throughout Mesopotamia, young men learned to read and write Sumerian as well as Akkadian, to copy and interpret classical literary texts, and to perform religious rituals according to traditional prescriptions. This scholarly tradition maintained Sumerian learning for another 1,000 years, long after Sumerian had ceased to be a spoken language. The influence of Sumerian civilization extended far beyond Mesopotamia itself. Trade networks established by Sumerian merchants had introduced Mesopotamian goods and ideas to distant lands, while the political and military success of Mesopotamian empires had spread Sumerian-derived institutions throughout the ancient Near East. By 1500 BCE, cuneiform writing was being used from Iran to Egypt, and Mesopotamian legal and administrative practices had been adopted by kingdoms throughout the region. The Kingdom of Elam, in what is now southwestern Iran, provides a good example of how Sumerian influence spread to neighbouring regions. The Elamites had been in contact with Sumerian since the 4th millennium BCE, alternately fighting and trading with the Mesopotamian city-states. Over time, they adopted many Sumerian cultural practices, including cuneiform writing, cylinder seal art, and temple architecture, while maintaining their own language and political independence. Similarly, the kingdoms of Syria and Anatolia incorporated Sumerian-derived elements into their own cultural traditions. The great trading city of Ebla in northern Syria used a local version of cuneiform writing to record commercial transactions and diplomatic correspondence, in the Ablate language. The Hittites of Anatolia adopted Mesopotamian literary texts, legal procedures, and religious practices while creating their own distinctive imperial culture. Even more distant regions felt Sumerian influence. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley maintained trade contacts with Mesopotamia and may have adopted some Sumerian technological innovations. Egyptian art and architecture show occasional Mesopotamian influences, particularly during periods of direct contact between the two civilizations. The emerging Greek civilization of the Aegean incorporated Mesopotamian astronomical observations and mathematical techniques. By 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age civilization that had been built on Sumerian foundations was facing serious challenges. The collapse of several major kingdoms, invasions by nomadic peoples, disruptions in trade networks, and technological changes associated with the spread of ironworking all contributed to what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. But even during this period of disruption, Sumerian cultural traditions continued to influence the emerging Iron Age civilizations. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East from about 900 to 612 BCE, was in many ways the heir of Sumerian civilization. Assyrian kings claimed to be restoring the ancient glories of Mesopotamia. Assyrian scribes preserved and copied Sumerian literary texts, and Assyrian priests maintained traditional Sumerian religious practices. The Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained thousands of tablets, preserving Sumerian and Akkadian literature for future generations. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which succeeded Assyria as the dominant Mesopotamian power, was even more explicitly committed to preserving Sumerian traditions. Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt the ancient temples of Babylon according to traditional architectural principles, while his scholars compiled comprehensive dictionaries and commentaries on Sumerian texts. The last great flowering of cuneiform scholarship occurred during this period, as Babylonian intellectuals made systematic efforts to preserve their ancient heritage. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE marked the end of independent Mesopotamian political power, but it did not immediately end Mesopotamian culture. The Persians were tolerant rulers who allowed their subjects to maintain traditional practices and institutions. Cuneiform writing continued to be used for local administration and religious purposes, while Sumerian and Akkadian texts continued to be copied and studied in temple schools. The real end of the Sumerian tradition came gradually during the Hellenistic period, as Greek became the dominant language of scholarship and administration throughout the Near East. The last cuneiform texts date from the 1st century CE, more than 3,000 years after the first Sumerian tablets. The last scholars who could read Sumerian literature died sometime during the early centuries of the Christian era, taking with them the direct connection to humanity's first civilization. But the influence of Sumerian civilization did not end with the death of its last scholars. Many Sumerian innovations had become so fundamental to human culture that they continued to shape later developments even after their origins were forgotten. The concept of written law, for example, passed from the Sumerians to the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans, and eventually became a cornerstone of Western legal tradition. Similarly, Sumerian literary themes and motifs continued to influence later literature long after the original texts were lost. The flood story from the Gilgamesh epic influenced the biblical account of Noah's Ark. The theme of a hero's quest for immortality, central to Sumerian literature, reappeared in Greek, Roman, and medieval European texts. The idea of divine kingship, developed in Sumerian city-states, influenced political thought throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. The rediscovery of Sumerian civilization began in the mid-19th century, when European archaeologists started excavating the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. The decipherment of cuneiform writing in the 1850s opened up vast libraries of ancient texts, including many Sumerian works that had been preserved in Babylonian and Assyrian archives. For the first time in more than a millennium, scholars could read the actual words of the people who had created civilization. The archaeological recovery of Sumerian culture has continued for more than 150 years, with each generation of scholars adding new discoveries and interpretations. The Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed the wealth and sophistication of early Sumerian society. The tablets from Kanesh in Turkey, discovered in the 1940s, showed the extent of Sumerian commercial networks. The texts from Ebla, found in the 1970s, demonstrated the spread of Sumerian cultural influence throughout Syria and Palestine. Modern scholarship has revealed the Sumerians to be far more complex and sophisticated than earlier generations realized. Rather than being the simple farmers and priest-kings of older historical accounts, they emerge as skilled administrators, innovative technologists, creative artists, and profound thinkers who grappled with fundamental questions about human existence, divine justice, and social organization. Their solutions to these problems influenced every subsequent civilization in the region, and, through various channels of transmission, continue to influence our own world today. The Sumerian achievement was remarkable not just for its antiquity, but for its comprehensiveness. In the space of less than 2 millennia, between about 3,500 and 1,750 BCE, the Sumerians and their immediate successors created most of the institutions and innovations that we associate with civilization itself. They developed writing, law, government, formal education, organized religion, monumental architecture, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, and literature. They established trade networks, built cities, created empires, and explored fundamental questions about human nature and destiny. Perhaps most remarkably, they did all of this without significant precedents to guide them. Unlike later civilizations, which could build on earlier achievements and learn from previous mistakes, the Sumerians had to invent civilization from scratch. Every institution they created, every technology they developed, every social innovation they pioneered had to be worked out through trial and error, experimentation and adaptation. The fact that so many of their innovations proved durable, that their legal principles, religious concepts, literary themes, and technological achievements continued to influence later cultures for thousands of years, suggests that the Sumerians succeeded in identifying fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization. Their solutions to the basic problems of civilization were not perfect, but they were workable and adaptable enough to serve as foundations for all subsequent developments in the region. The Sumerian legacy is not without its dark aspects. The same organizational skills that built irrigation systems and temples also created the first systematic armies and the first programs of conquest and enslavement. The same technological innovations that increased agricultural productivity also made possible more destructive forms of warfare. The same social hierarchies that provided stability and coordination also created unprecedented inequalities of wealth and power. These contradictions were not accidental features of Sumerian civilization, but necessary consequences of the choices the Sumerians made in creating complex society. The benefits of civilization, security, prosperity, cultural achievement, required the development of institutions and technologies that could also be used for oppression and destruction. The Sumerians were the first people to face these moral ambiguities inherent in civilized life, and their literature shows a deep awareness of the costs as well as the benefits of their achievements. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in particular, can be read as a meditation on the double-edged nature of civilization itself. Gilgamesh is a great king who builds walls to protect his city and temples to honor the gods, but he's also a tyrant who oppresses his subjects and violates natural law. His friendship with Enkidu represents an attempt to reconcile civilization with wildness, culture with nature, but this reconciliation proves temporary and fragile. The epic's ultimate message, that immortality is reserved for the gods and that humans must find meaning in mortal achievements, reflects a mature understanding of both the possibilities and limitations of human society. This tension between achievement and limitation, between progress and loss, runs throughout Sumerian culture and helps explain both its appeal and its eventual disappearance. The Sumerians created a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and creativity, but they also created a society that was inherently unstable and environmentally unsustainable. Their irrigation agriculture produced abundant harvests for many centuries, but eventually led to soil salinization and declining productivity. Their competitive city-state system encouraged innovation and cultural achievement, but also led to destructive warfare and political fragmentation. In the end, Sumerian civilization fell victim to the same forces that had created it: the drive for innovation, the competition for resources, and the restless human desire for something better. Later peoples built on Sumerian achievements while avoiding some of their mistakes, creating more durable political institutions and more sustainable economic practices. But they did so by accepting limitations and making compromises that the Sumerians in their creative audacity, had been unwilling to make. The story of Sumerian civilization is thus both an inspiration and a warning. It demonstrates the extraordinary potential of human creativity and organization, the remarkable achievements that are possible when people work together toward common goals. But it also illustrates the fragility of even the greatest civilizations, the ease with which human achievements can be lost, and the importance of balancing ambition with wisdom, innovation with stability, and progress with sustainability. As we face our own civilizational challenges in the 21st century, environmental degradation, political polarization, technological disruption, social inequality, the Sumerian experience offers both hope and caution. Like the Sumerians, we're pioneers exploring uncharted territories of human possibility. Like them, we must balance competing demands and navigate difficult trade-offs between conflicting values. And like them, we must remember that our achievements, however impressive, are not permanent. That civilization is not a destination but a process, not a possession but a responsibility. The Sumerians built their civilization in mud and reeds, in the marshy deltas of southern Mesopotamia where the great rivers met the sea. They created beauty from humble materials, order from chaos, meaning from uncertainty. Their cities have crumbled, their language has been forgotten, their gods no longer receive worship, but their fundamental insight, that human beings can transcend the limitations of nature through cooperation, creativity, and courage, remains as relevant today as it was 5,000 years ago. In the end, the greatest Sumerian achievement may have been simply the demonstration that civilization is possible at all. Before the Sumerians, humans lived in small groups, bound by kinship ties and limited by what they could produce with their own hands. The Sumerians showed that people could live together in large numbers, cooperate across ethnic and linguistic boundaries, and create achievements that no individual could accomplish alone. This possibility, once demonstrated, could never be completely forgotten. Even when specific Sumerian innovations were lost, the basic idea of civilization, the belief that humans could create better lives through collective effort, survived to inspire later generations. The black-headed people of ancient Sumer sleep now in the dust of their ruined cities, but their dream of human possibility lives on. In every school where children learn to read, in every court where justice is administered, in every temple where people seek meaning beyond themselves, something of the Sumerian legacy endures. They were the first to imagine that humans could be more than naked apes struggling for survival in a hostile world. They were the first to prove that imagination could become reality. That proof, once given, can never be entirely taken away. And so, the story ends where it began, in the marshy deltas where civilization was born. The rivers still flow, carrying silt and memories toward the sea. The sun still rises over the ancient land, illuminating ruins that speak of vanished glory. But in those ruins, if we know how to look, we can still see the reflection of our own hopes, our own struggles, our own unending quest to create meaning from chaos and beauty from the humble materials of earthly existence. The Sumerians are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their greatest creation, the idea of civilization itself, lives on in every human community that chooses cooperation over conflict, justice over oppression, hope over despair. In that sense, we're all inheritors of Sumer, all citizens of that first great experiment in human possibility. The marshlands are quiet now, but they remember. The ancient cities dream beneath the sand, patient as they have been patient for millennia, waiting for the next chapter in humanity's long story. And perhaps in some future dawn we cannot yet imagine, other voices will tell our story as we have told theirs, with the same mixture of wonder and sadness, pride and humility that marks all human contemplation of our brief passage through eternity. Time flows like the great rivers of Mesopotamia, carrying all things toward an endless sea. But some things, courage, creativity, the stubborn human refusal to accept limits, prove stronger than time itself. These are the true monuments of Sumer, more enduring than brick or stone, more lasting than bronze or gold. They are the gifts the black-headed people gave to all humanity, and for as long as humans dream of better tomorrows, those gifts will continue to enrich our common heritage. In the silence of the ancient land, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes of their voices, still see the glimmer of their torches in the darkness, still feel the weight of their hopes and fears. They are calling to us across the centuries, these first builders of cities, first writers of laws, first seekers after immortal truth. They are reminding us that we too are part of their story, that we too have a role to play in the ongoing human experiment that began so long ago in the marshes of Sumer. The story never truly ends. It only pauses, waiting for the next teller, the next listener, the next dreamer bold enough to imagine that humans can transcend their limitations and create something beautiful from the mud and chaos of existence. The Sumerians showed us the way, the rest is up to us. But before we let the ancient voices fade completely into the night, let us linger a while longer in their world, exploring the intricate tapestries of daily existence that made their great achievements possible. For behind every monumental temple and royal palace, behind every cuneiform tablet and golden ornament, lay the ordinary lives of extraordinary people who transformed the very nature of human existence through countless small acts of creativity and cooperation. The seasonal rhythms of Sumerian life were intimately connected to the great rivers that gave birth to their civilization. In the flood season, when the Tigris and Euphrates swelled with snowmelt from distant mountains, entire communities mobilized to maintain and repair the intricate networks of canals, dikes and reservoirs that channeled the life-giving water to their fields. This was dangerous work. Sudden surges could sweep away workers, collapsing banks could trap the unwary, and disease often spread through the crowded camps where labourers lived during the flood months. Yet these communal work projects were also times of celebration and social bonding. Workers from different cities and social classes laboured side by side, sharing tools, techniques and stories. Young people met future spouses, craftsmen learned new skills, and elders passed down knowledge of water management that had been refined over generations. The great irrigation works were not just engineering marvels, but social achievements that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and trust. When the floods receded and the growing season began, the Sumerian landscape transformed into a patchwork of carefully tended fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Barley and wheat grew in neat rows, their green shoots emerging from the dark, fertile soil that the rivers had deposited. Date palms provided shade and sweetness, their tall trunks marking property boundaries and serving as landmarks for travellers. Vegetable gardens flourished in the spaces between larger fields, tended primarily by women and children who contributed essential diversity to the Sumerian diet. The harvest months brought their own intensity of activity. Entire families worked from dawn to dusk, cutting grain with bronze sickles, threshing it with wooden flails, and winnowing it in the constant desert wind. The grain had to be harvested quickly before the intense summer heat could damage it, and then stored carefully to prevent spoilage during the long months before the next harvest. Community granaries managed by temple officials served as insurance against individual crop failures and as reserves for years when the floods came too early or too late. The social rhythms of harvest time reflected the complex stratification of Sumerian society. Wealthy landowners supervised the work but rarely participated in the backbreaking labour of cutting and carrying grain. Free farmers worked their own plots with the help of their families and hired labourers. Temple workers received assigned plots to cultivate in addition to their regular duties. Slaves, prisoners of war and debt servants provided much of the heavy labour, working under the supervision of overseers who carried wooden staffs as symbols of their authority. But harvest time also brought opportunities for social mobility and economic advancement. Skilled workers could earn bonuses for exceptional productivity. Clever farmers could negotiate better terms for the following year. Ambitious young people could attract the attention of wealthy patrons or temple officials. Even slaves could sometimes accumulate enough earnings to purchase their freedom or establish small businesses of their own. The urban workshops of Sumerian cities hummed with constant activity throughout the year. Metalworkers hammered bronze into tools and weapons, their forges glowing red in dark corners of the city. The rhythm of their hammers created a musical backdrop to city life, punctuated by the hiss of a hot metal plunged into water and the scraping of files smoothing rough edges. Master craftsmen guarded their techniques jealously, passing them down to carefully chosen apprentices who began their training as young children and spent decades perfecting their skills. Textile production was equally sophisticated and far more widespread. Almost every household participated in some aspect of cloth making, from the spinning of thread to the weaving of finished fabric. Women were the primary textile workers, but the industry also employed significant numbers of men as dyers, finishers, and merchants. The finest fabrics, silks imported from distant lands, woolens dyed with precious pigments, linens woven so tightly they seemed almost transparent, were luxury items that commanded high prices and served as status symbols for the wealthy. Pottery workshops produced everything from simple cooking pots to elaborate ceremonial vessels. The potter's wheel, one of humanity's most important technological innovations, had been perfected in Sumerian workshops, allowing craftsmen to create vessels of unprecedented symmetry and thinness. Specialized potters developed distinctive styles and techniques that were passed down through families and guilds, creating regional traditions that archaeologists can still identify thousands of years later. The daily rhythms of Sumerian family life varied considerably depending on social class and occupation, but certain patterns were nearly universal. Households rose before dawn, when the air was still cool and the day's work could begin without the crushing heat of midday sun. The first meal was usually simple: bread, beer, and perhaps some dates or other fruit. Children helped with age-appropriate tasks while adults began their primary occupations. The heat of midday brought a pause in most outdoor activities. This was the time for rest, indoor work, and social interaction. Family members gathered in the shade of courtyards to share the main meal of the day, to discuss business or family matters, and to escape the brutal sun that made outdoor labour dangerous. Young children napped while older ones practiced reading and writing, or learned craft skills from their parents and relatives. Evening brought renewed activity as temperatures dropped. This was when many of the most important social interactions occurred. Neighbours gathered to share news and gossip. Young people participated in courtship rituals under the watchful eyes of their elders. Religious observances and community festivals often took place in the cooler evening hours, when people could gather in large numbers without risking heat exhaustion. The position of women in Sumerian society was complex and varied significantly over time and across social classes. In the earliest periods, women appear to have enjoyed relatively high status and considerable economic freedom. Female deities held important positions in the pantheon. Women could own and inherit property, and some women held positions of significant political and religious authority. The institution of the Naditu priestesses provides a particularly interesting example of women's roles in Sumerian society. These women, often from wealthy families, dedicated their lives to religious service and were prohibited from marrying or bearing children. In return, they received extensive property rights and could engage in business activities on their own behalf. Some Naditu accumulated considerable wealth and influence, operating what were essentially banking and real estate businesses while maintaining their religious obligations. Royal women also wielded significant power in certain periods. Queen Pwabi of Ur was buried with a retinue of servants and soldiers, suggesting that she held authority in her own right, rather than merely as the wife of a king. Later Sumerian queens served as regents for young sons, led armies into battle, and patronized artists and scholars. The goddess Inanna's prominent role in Sumerian religion may have reflected and reinforced the real political power of mortal women. But women's status was never uniform or unchanging. Legal codes increasingly restricted women's rights and placed them under the authority of male relatives. Marriage contracts treated women as valuable property to be transferred from fathers to husbands. Divorce laws favoured men, and women who violated social norms could face severe punishment, including being forced into temple service or sold into slavery. The experience of childhood in ancient Sumer varied dramatically depending on family circumstances. Children of wealthy families began formal education around age 6 or 7, learning to read and write in both Sumerian and Akkadian. This was demanding work. Cuneiform script contained hundreds of different signs, each of which had to be memorized and practiced until it could be written perfectly. Students copied literary texts, mathematical problems, and legal documents, gradually building the skills that would allow them to enter careers in the priesthood, government, or commerce. Education was harsh by modern standards. Students who made mistakes or failed to pay attention could be beaten with wooden rods. School days were long and the curriculum was rigid, focused on rote memorization rather than creative thinking or individual expression. But for those who succeeded, education offered unprecedented opportunities for social advancement and personal fulfillment. Children from poorer families received different kinds of education. Boys learned their father's trades, starting with simple tasks and gradually taking on more complex responsibilities. Girls learned household management, textile production, and food preparation from their mothers and other female relatives. Some children from poor families were sent to work for wealthy households or temples, where they might receive limited education in exchange for their labour. The treatment of childhood illness reveals much about Sumerian understanding of medicine and the supernatural. Sick children were treated with combinations of herbal remedies, magical incantations, and ritual procedures designed to drive away the demons that were believed to cause disease. Some of these treatments were surprisingly effective: willow bark tea for fever, honey for wound care, and various herbal preparations that modern science has shown to have genuine therapeutic properties. But medical treatment was always intertwined with religious belief and magical practice. Physicians were also priests who diagnosed illnesses by examining omens and performed elaborate rituals to appease the gods and spirits responsible for sickness. The boundary between medicine and magic was not clearly drawn, and successful healing was attributed as much to divine favour as to human skill. The games and toys of Sumerian children provide glimpses into a more playful side of ancient life. Archaeological excavations have uncovered toy chariots, spinning tops, dolls made of clay and cloth, and board games with elaborate rules that children and adults could play together. These artifacts suggest that despite the harsh realities of ancient life, Sumerians found time for pleasure, creativity, and the innocent joys of childhood. Religious festivals provided the most important breaks in the routine of daily life. These celebrations could last for days or even weeks, involving entire communities in elaborate processions, ritual dramas, and communal feasting. The New Year festival, celebrating the renewal of life and the victory of order over chaos, was the most important of these occasions. During this festival, the normal social order was temporarily suspended. Servants could mock their masters, women could speak freely in public, and children could participate in activities normally reserved for adults. The preparation for major festivals involved the entire community. Bakers worked for days to prepare special breads and pastries. Brewers produced vast quantities of beer in dozens of different varieties. Craftsmen created masks, costumes, and ceremonial objects needed for ritual performances. Musicians practiced songs and dances that might be performed only once a year. The economic impact of these festivals was enormous, but they also served crucial social functions by reinforcing community bonds and providing outlets for tensions that might otherwise lead to conflict. The religious processions that marked these festivals were spectacular displays of wealth, power, and devotion. The statue of the city god, normally kept in the innermost sanctuary of the temple, was brought out and carried through the streets on an elaborate palanquin. Priests in colourful robes chanted ancient hymns, while musicians played harps, drums, and flutes. Dancers performed ritual movements that told stories of creation, conquest, and divine love. The entire community participated, from the highest nobles to the humblest slaves, all united in worship of their common protector. These festivals also served important economic functions. Merchants from distant cities arrived to trade during the celebrations, bringing exotic goods and news from the outside world. Local craftsmen displayed their finest work, hoping to attract wealthy customers or foreign buyers. Farmers sold surplus produce to the crowds of visitors. Young people met potential marriage partners from other communities. The festivals were thus vital not just to religious and social life, but to the economic prosperity of the entire region. The darker aspects of Sumerian religious practice also emerged during these festivals. Some celebrations involved ritual combats, in which prisoners of war or condemned criminals fought to the death for the entertainment of the gods and the crowd. Other festivals featured elaborate sacrifices of animals, and occasionally humans, whose blood was believed to strengthen the bonds between the earthly and divine realms. The practice of human sacrifice in ancient Sumer remains one of the most disturbing aspects of their civilization. The royal tombs at Ur provide unmistakable evidence that rulers were sometimes buried with their entire households. Servants, soldiers, musicians, and courtiers who accompanied their masters into death. The precise mechanics of these sacrifices remain unclear, but the evidence suggests that the victims went willingly, perhaps believing that they would continue to serve their lords in the afterlife, or that their deaths would ensure their own eventual resurrection. These practices were not casual acts of cruelty, but serious religious observances based on deeply held beliefs about the nature of death divine authority, and cosmic order. The Sumerians believed that the proper functioning of the universe depended on maintaining correct relationships between humans and gods, and that sometimes these relationships required the ultimate sacrifice. The volunteers for these rituals may have seen themselves as heroes, performing essential services for their communities. But human sacrifice was never the norm in Sumerian society. Most religious observances involved offerings of food, drink, and valuable objects rather than living beings. Animal sacrifice was more common, but still reserved for special occasions and conducted according to strict ritual procedures designed to minimize suffering and maximize spiritual benefit. The vast majority of Sumerian religious practice focused on prayer, meditation, and the performance of traditional ceremonies that reinforce social bonds and individual devotion. The role of dreams and visions in Sumerian religious life deserves special attention. The Sumerians believed that gods communicated with humans primarily through dreams, and elaborate procedures existed for interpreting divine messages received during sleep. Professional dream interpreters served kings and wealthy families, while ordinary people consulted priests or relied on traditional knowledge passed down through families. Some dreams were considered so important that they shaped major political decisions. Kings delayed military campaigns, changed diplomatic policies, or undertook massive construction projects based on divine instructions received in dreams. The Epic of Gilgamesh is filled with prophetic dreams that guide the hero's actions and reveal divine intentions. These were not merely literary devices, but reflections of genuine Sumerian beliefs about the permeability of the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness. The interpretation of dreams required extensive knowledge of traditional symbolism and mythology. Water dreams might indicate coming floods or divine favour. Dreams of flying could suggest spiritual elevation or dangerous pride. Animals in dreams represented various gods or personal qualities, while dreams of death might paradoxically indicate coming prosperity or long life. The complexity of this symbolic system required years of study to master and created a professional class of religious specialists who served as intermediaries between ordinary people and the divine realm. The Sumerian understanding of mental illness was similarly intertwined with religious belief. Conditions that we would recognize as depression, anxiety, or psychosis were attributed to possession by demons or punishment by angry gods. Treatment involved combinations of exorcism, ritual purification, and herbal medicine designed to restore the proper balance between the sufferer and the supernatural forces affecting their life. Some of these treatments were surprisingly sophisticated. The use of music therapy for emotional disturbances, the prescription of regular exercise and social interaction for depressive conditions, and the recognition that physical and mental health were closely connected, all demonstrate a holistic understanding of human wellness that was remarkably advanced for its time. The question of Sumerian attitudes toward death and dying reveals both their profound humanity and their distinctive worldview. Unlike many ancient peoples, the Sumerians did not generally believe in a blessed afterlife for the righteous or eternal punishment for the wicked. The underworld was a gloomy place where all the dead, regardless of their earthly status or moral character, existed as pale shadows dependent on offerings from the living for sustenance. This belief system had profound implications for how Sumerians approached life. Since there was no hope of posthumous reward, meaning and fulfillment had to be found in earthly achievements. Great deeds, artistic creations, and the establishment of lasting institutions became ways of achieving a kind of immortality through memory and influence. The Sumerian emphasis on leaving behind written records, monumental architecture, and cultural traditions can be understood as attempts to transcend the limitations of individual mortality. Funeral practices reflected these beliefs, while also serving important social functions. Wealthy families spent enormous resources on elaborate tombs, grave goods, and funeral ceremonies that demonstrated their status and ensured their continued influence after death. The objects buried with the dead, tools, weapons, jewellery, food, and drink, were intended to provide comfort in the underworld while also displaying the family's wealth and devotion. But even ordinary burials involved careful attention to proper procedures and appropriate offerings. Bodies were washed, anointed with oils, and wrapped in fine cloth before being placed in graves with pottery vessels containing food and drink for the journey to the underworld. Family members made regular offerings at grave sites, maintaining connections with deceased relatives who were believed to influence the fortunes of the living. The treatment of the bodies of executed criminals and enemies killed in battle reveals another aspect of Sumerian attitudes toward death. These individuals were often denied proper burial, their bodies left exposed to scavengers or thrown into unmarked pits. This was considered the ultimate punishment, worse than death itself, since it condemned the victim to eternal wandering in the underworld without the comfort of regular offerings from living relatives. The influence of climate and environment on Sumerian culture cannot be overstated. The harsh desert climate, with its extreme heat, sudden storms and unpredictable floods, shaped everything from architectural styles to religious beliefs to social organization. Houses were built with thick walls and small windows to provide insulation from heat. Courtyards and rooftop terraces allowed families to enjoy cooler evening air while maintaining privacy. The scarcity of certain materials led to remarkable innovations in design and construction. The absence of stone and timber forced Sumerian architects to develop sophisticated techniques for building with mud brick, creating structures that were both functional and beautiful despite their humble materials. The invention of the arch, the dome, and various forms of decorative brickwork all emerged from the necessity of working within environmental constraints. Weather patterns influenced not just construction, but also social customs and religious observances. The hot season brought restrictions on outdoor activities and changes in dietary patterns as fresh foods became scarce. The flood season required community-wide cooperation and emergency planning. The brief spring growing season demanded intense labour and careful timing to maximise agricultural yields. Sumerian responses to natural disasters reveal both their practical competence and their spiritual resilience. Floods that destroyed irrigation systems were rebuilt with improvements based on hard-won experience. Droughts that threatened food supplies were met with rationing programs and emergency distribution of stored grain. Earthquakes that toppled buildings were followed by reconstruction efforts that incorporated new techniques for structural stability. But these practical responses were always accompanied by religious interpretations that sought to understand divine intentions behind natural events. A devastating flood might be seen as punishment for ritual failures or social injustices. A bountiful harvest could be attributed to successful ceremonies or the favour of patron deities. This dual approach, practical problem-solving combined with spiritual interpretation, characterised Sumerian responses to environmental challenges throughout their history. The development of Sumerian astronomy emerged directly from practical needs related to agriculture and religion. Farmers needed to predict the timing of floods and optimal planting dates. Priests needed to schedule religious festivals according to traditional calendars. Military commanders needed to plan campaigns based on seasonal conditions. These practical requirements led to careful observation of celestial phenomena and the gradual accumulation of astronomical knowledge. The Sumerian calendar was based on lunar months, with adjustments made periodically to keep it aligned with the solar year and seasonal patterns. This created a complex system that required considerable mathematical sophistication to maintain. Priests who specialized in calendar calculations became some of the most learned individuals in Sumerian society, masters of arithmetic, geometry, and observational techniques that would influence all subsequent astronomical traditions. The identification of planets, constellations, and celestial cycles led to the development of astrological beliefs that connected earthly events with heavenly phenomena. The movements of planets were thought to influence human affairs, while eclipses and unusual celestial events were interpreted as omens indicating divine intentions. This connection between astronomy and astrology would persist throughout Mesopotamian history and influence Greek, Islamic, and medieval European approaches to understanding the cosmos. Sumerian mathematics emerged from practical needs but developed into an abstract system of remarkable sophistication. The demands of managing complex irrigation systems, calculating areas and volumes for construction projects, and maintaining accurate financial records led to innovations in arithmetic, geometry and algebra that were far ahead of their time. The sexagesimal number system, based on units of 60, allowed for precise calculations involving fractions and complex measurements. This system was particularly well suited to astronomical calculations and remains in use today for measuring time and angles. Sumerian mathematicians developed procedures for calculating square roots, solving quadratic equations, and working with geometric series that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Mathematical tablets from Sumerian schools show that students were learning concepts that we would consider advanced. The properties of right triangles, methods for calculating compound interest, techniques for solving optimization problems. This mathematical sophistication was not merely academic, but was applied to real-world problems in engineering, construction, and commerce. The relationship between mathematics and religion in Sumerian culture reveals another dimension of their intellectual achievements. Numbers had symbolic as well as practical significance, with certain values considered sacred or particularly powerful. The number 7 appeared frequently in religious contexts, while multiples of 60 were often used in temple architecture and ritual procedures. This symbolic dimension of mathematics may have contributed to its development as an abstract discipline. By treating numbers as entities with inherent properties and relationships, independent of their practical applications, Sumerian scholars laid the foundation for modern mathematics foundations for mathematical thinking that would influence all subsequent intellectual traditions. The legacy of Sumerian medical practice deserves more detailed examination, as it reveals both their empirical observations and their theoretical understanding of health and disease. Sumerian physicians compiled extensive lists of symptoms, treatments, and therapeutic procedures that demonstrate careful attention to clinical detail and systematic approaches to healing. Many Sumerian medical practices were surprisingly effective by modern standards. The use of honey as an antiseptic, willow bark preparations for pain relief, and various herbal remedies with demonstrated therapeutic properties show that Sumerian healers were skilled observers who learned from experience and refined their techniques over generations. Surgical procedures were also practiced, though they were reserved for extreme cases and performed according to strict ritual protocols. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sumerians performed trepanation, cataract surgery, and various forms of wound care with bronze instruments that were both functional and ceremonially appropriate. The integration of medical and religious practice in Sumerian healing reflects their holistic understanding of health and disease. Physical symptoms were seen as manifestations of spiritual imbalances that required both practical treatment and religious intervention. This approach meant that healing involved not just the physician and patient, but entire families and communities who participated in therapeutic rituals and supported the recovery process. The role of women in Sumerian medicine was significant, but often overlooked in written records that focused on male physicians and priests. Women served as midwives, herbalists, and healers, specializing in conditions affecting women and children. Their knowledge was passed down through oral traditions and practical training that complemented the formal medical education available to men. Archaeological evidence suggests that some women achieved high status as medical practitioners, with elaborate burials that included medical instruments and pharmaceutical supplies. These female healers may have served wealthy households or temple communities where their expertise was particularly valued. The development of Sumerian legal thinking represents another major intellectual achievement that influenced all subsequent legal traditions. Sumerian law codes were not simply lists of punishments, but systematic attempts to establish principles of justice that could be applied consistently across different cases and circumstances. The concept of proportional punishment, that penalties should be appropriate to the severity of crimes, emerged from practical experience with dispute resolution and reflected deep thinking about the nature of justice itself. The recognition of different categories of evidence, the establishment of procedures for witness examination, and the creation of appeals processes all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of legal principles. Sumerian contract law was particularly advanced, reflecting the complex commercial relationships that characterize their urban economy. Contracts for partnerships, loans, real estate transactions, and employment relationships were standardized according to legal precedents while allowing for variations based on specific circumstances. The role of oaths and ritual procedures in legal proceedings reveals the religious dimensions of Sumerian jurisprudence. Legal truth was not merely a matter of evidence and logical reasoning, but involved divine judgment that could be invoked through proper ceremonial procedures. This integration of secular and sacred authority provided legitimacy for legal decisions while also limiting the arbitrary exercise of judicial power. Women's legal status in Sumerian society was complex and evolved considerably over time. Early legal codes granted women significant property rights and allowed them to initiate divorce proceedings, engage in business transactions, and inherit from their parents. Later codes restricted these rights, while still maintaining some protections for women in vulnerable circumstances. The treatment of slaves and foreigners in Sumerian law reveals both the limitations and the achievements of their legal thinking. While slavery was accepted as a normal institution, legal codes provided some protections for slaves and established procedures for manumission. Foreign merchants and residents were granted specific rights and protections that encouraged trade while maintaining social order. The influence of Sumerian legal principles on later Mesopotamian law codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, demonstrates the enduring significance of their jurisprudential innovations. Concepts of legal procedure, categories of evidence, and approaches to punishment that originated in Sumerian city-states continued to influence legal thinking throughout the ancient world. As we near the end of our long journey through Sumerian civilization, it becomes clear that their greatest achievement was not any single innovation but the creation of a complete way of life that integrated practical problem-solving with profound spiritual insight. They showed that humans could live together in large numbers without losing their essential humanity, that complex societies could be both efficient and just, and that material prosperity could coexist with cultural creativity and religious devotion. The contradictions and tensions within Sumerian civilization, between cooperation and competition, between innovation and tradition, between individual achievement and collective responsibility, were not flaws to be overcome but essential features of the human condition that every civilization must navigate. The Sumerians were the first to face these challenges on a large scale, and their solutions, while not perfect, proved durable enough to influence human societies for thousands of years. Their approach to these eternal human problems was characterized by a remarkable combination of practical flexibility and principled commitment. They adapted their institutions and practices to changing circumstances while maintaining core values and beliefs that provided continuity and meaning. They embraced innovation and experimentation while respecting traditional wisdom and ancestral achievements. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that civilization is not a destination but a process, and not a set of institutions but a way of thinking about human possibilities. The specific forms of their city-states, temples and law codes have long since disappeared, but their fundamental insight that humans can consciously shape their social environment to promote flourishing and prevent suffering remains as relevant today as it was 5,000 years ago. The story of Sumerian civilization is ultimately the story of human potential realized through collective effort and individual creativity. It is a reminder that our current achievements, impressive as they may be, rest on foundations laid by countless generations of people who face similar challenges with courage, intelligence, and determination. It is also a warning that civilizations, however great, are fragile constructions that require constant attention and renewal to survive and flourish. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world sleeps and time seems to pause, we can still sense the presence of those ancient builders, those first dreamers of cities and laws and written words. They speak to us across the millennia, reminding us that we too are part of their great experiment, that we too have responsibilities to future generations who will inherit the world we leave behind. The rivers still flow through the lands where they built their cities, carrying memories and possibilities toward an endless sea. The stars still wheel overhead in patterns they first learned to read and interpret. The earth still responds to human labour and imagination, as it did when they first pressed seeds into irrigated soil and watched cities rise from the mud of ancient marshlands. We are their heirs, inheritors of their achievements and their unfinished business. The challenges we face, creating just societies, balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility, adapting to environmental change, using technology wisely, are the same fundamental problems they confronted in their own time and place. Their example suggests that these challenges can be met, that human intelligence and cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, that civilization is not only possible, but worth the enormous effort required to create and maintain it. And so their story becomes our story, their dreams become our inheritance, their unfinished work becomes our responsibility. In every act of cooperation, in every moment of creative insight, in every choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to hope rather than despair, we honour their memory and continue their great work of making human life more beautiful, more meaningful, and more just. The dawn is coming, as it has come every day for countless millennia, bringing new possibilities and new responsibilities. The Sumerian cities are silent now, but their dreams live on in every human community that dares to imagine a better tomorrow. The black-headed people sleep, but they are not forgotten. Their greatest creation, the idea that humans can consciously create civilization, burns as bright as ever, a torch passed from generation to generation, a light that will never be extinguished as long as humans continue to dream of better worlds and work to make those dreams real. Time flows on, patient and eternal, carrying all things toward an unknown future. But some things prove stronger than time: courage, creativity, hope, and the enduring human conviction that life can be more than mere survival, that existence can be transformed into meaning, that the mud and chaos of the world can be shaped into something beautiful and lasting. These are the true monuments of Sumer, more enduring than any ziggurat, more precious than any golden treasure. They are the gifts that the first civilization gave to all humanity, and they will remain our inheritance as long as human hearts beat with the ancient rhythm of hope, and human hands reach toward the stars that first guided those distant ancestors home across the marshes of eternity. Yet there remain countless stories within stories, layers of human experience that archaeology continues to unveil in the patient dust of excavated ruins. Each cuneiform tablet discovered, each foundation stone uncovered, each fragment of pottery or corroded bronze tool adds another thread to the vast tapestry of Sumerian existence. The more we learn about these ancient people, the more complex and fascinating they become, defying simple categorization and revealing depths of human experience that resonate across the millennia. The merchant families of ancient Sumer lived lives of adventure and risk that would challenge even modern international traders. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kanesh in Turkey reveals the extraordinary scope of Sumerian commercial networks, with trading posts established thousands of miles from home, where Mesopotamian merchants lived for years at a time, maintaining connections with distant families while adapting to foreign customs and languages. These merchant adventurers were not merely traders but cultural ambassadors who carried Sumerian ideas, technologies, and artistic styles to the far corners of the known world. A Sumerian merchant establishing a trading post in the mountains of Anatolia brought with him not just goods to sell, but cuneiform writing, mathematical techniques, legal concepts, and religious practices that would influence local development for generations. The logistics of long-distance trade in the ancient world required extraordinary planning and cooperation. Caravans departing from Sumerian cities carried not just merchandise, but letters of credit, legal contracts, diplomatic correspondence, and personal messages that maintained the networks of relationship essential to commercial success. The journey from Mesopotamia to Anatolia could take months, with travellers facing bandits, hostile weather, political instability, and the constant risk of losing their investments to unforeseen circumstances. Yet the rewards of successful trading ventures were enormous. Merchants who managed to establish secure supply lines for precious commodities could accumulate vast fortunes that rivaled those of kings and high priests. Some merchant families maintained their trading empires for generations, passing down not just wealth, but specialized knowledge of foreign markets, transportation routes, and diplomatic relationships. The daily life of a Sumerian merchant family reveals fascinating details about social mobility and international connections in the ancient world. Wives of merchants often managed business operations while their husbands travelled, becoming skilled negotiators and financial managers in their own right. Children grew up speaking multiple languages and learning about distant lands they might never visit. Household servants included foreign slaves who brought knowledge of exotic technologies and cultural practices. The archives of merchant families, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, provide intimate glimpses into personal relationships that transcended cultural boundaries. Letters between Sumerian merchants and their foreign business partners reveal genuine friendships, shared concerns about family welfare, and mutual respect that developed despite differences in language, religion, and customs. These relationships were often maintained across decades, with merchants arranging marriages between their children and hosting extended visits that strengthened both business and personal bonds. The technological innovations that made long-distance trade possible deserve closer examination, as they represent some of humanity's most important advances in transportation, communication, and financial management. the development of wheeled vehicles, initially using solid wooden wheels and later progressing to spoked designs, revolutionized the movement of goods across land routes. Sumerian wheelwrights became master craftsmen whose expertise was sought throughout the ancient world. Maritime technology advanced equally dramatically during the Sumerian period. The invention of the sail, probably around 3500 BCE, transformed river and coastal transportation. Early Sumerian boats were simple reed constructions waterproofed with bitumen, but by 2500 BCE, Sumerian shipwrights were building sophisticated vessels capable of carrying large cargoes across the Persian Gulf to India and beyond. Navigation techniques developed by Sumerian sailors laid the foundations for all subsequent maritime exploration. The use of celestial observations for determining direction, the compilation of practical knowledge about winds and currents, and the development of standardized measurements for distance and time all emerged from the practical needs of merchants and sea captains who risked their lives and fortunes on uncertain voyages. The financial instruments developed to support long-distance trade were equally revolutionary. Letters of credit allowed merchants to transfer value across vast distances without physically transporting precious metals or goods. Partnership agreements distributed the risks of trading ventures among multiple investors. Insurance concepts, though primitive by modern standards, provided some protection against the inevitable losses that occurred in such dangerous occupations. The banking functions performed by Sumerian temples and wealthy families created the institutional framework for complex commercial relationships. Temple treasuries served as safe deposits for valuable goods, while temple officials provided loans at regulated interest rates to merchants embarking on trading expeditions. The development of standardized weights and measures facilitated fair exchange, while written contracts provided legal recourse when disputes arose. The social impact of long-distance trade on Sumerian cities was profound and sometimes disruptive. The influx of foreign goods, ideas, and people challenged traditional social hierarchies and cultural norms. Successful merchants could purchase social status that had traditionally been inherited, while exposure to foreign religions and philosophies raised questions about established beliefs and practices. Young people, in particular, were influenced by the cosmopolitan atmosphere that trade brought to Sumerian cities. Fashion in clothing, jewellery, and personal decoration reflected international influences. Musical instruments and artistic styles from distant lands were adopted and adapted to local tastes. Even dietary habits changed as exotic spices, preserved foods, and foreign cooking techniques became available to those who could afford them. But this cultural exchange was not entirely welcome to conservative elements in Sumerian society. Religious authorities worried about the influence of foreign deities and ritual practices. Political leaders feared that economic ties with foreign powers might compromise their city's independence. Social traditionalists were concerned about the disruption of established customs and the challenge to inherited privilege posed by newly wealthy merchant families. These tensions between tradition and innovation, between local loyalty and international connection, between inherited status and achieved wealth, created ongoing social dynamics that shaped Sumerian political and cultural development throughout their history. The same forces that brought prosperity and cultural enrichment also created instability and conflict that weakened traditional social bonds. The archaeological discovery of merchant archives has revolutionized our understanding of ancient economic systems. The Kanesh archives, discovered in the 1920s and still being studied today, contain more than 23,000 tablets documenting the activities of Assyrian merchants who had learned their trade from Sumerian predecessors. These documents reveal business practices of remarkable sophistication, including complex accounting procedures, international legal codes, and sophisticated financial instruments. Similar archives from Sumerian sites provide detailed information about domestic trade networks, craft production systems, and agricultural management that complements our knowledge of international commerce. We can trace the flow of goods from rural producers through urban markets to international trading networks, observing how local surpluses were transformed into global commodities. The role of women in Sumerian commercial activities deserves particular attention, as it reveals aspects of gender relationships that are often overlooked in traditional historical accounts. While men dominated long-distance trading expeditions, women played crucial roles in local markets, craft production, and financial management. Some women operated their own businesses, particularly in textiles, food processing, and luxury goods production. The letters of female merchants reveal personalities of remarkable independence and business acumen. These women negotiated contracts, managed employees, dealt with suppliers and customers, and accumulated significant personal wealth. Their success challenges stereotypical assumptions about women's roles in ancient societies and demonstrates the complex realities of gender relationships in early urban civilizations. The religious dimensions of Sumerian commercial life provide another fascinating perspective on their culture. Merchants regularly made offerings to gods associated with travel and trade, seeking divine protection for their ventures and thanksgiving for successful outcomes. Temple archives record substantial donations from wealthy merchants who attributed their prosperity to divine favour and who sought to maintain good relationships with the spiritual powers that governed their activities. Commercial law in Sumerian cities developed sophisticated procedures for resolving disputes between merchants from different cultural backgrounds. International arbitration systems allowed traders to appeal to neutral authorities when disagreements arose. Standardized contract forms reduced misunderstandings, while diplomatic protocols ensured that commercial disputes did not escalate into political conflicts between cities or nations. The seasonal rhythms of trade created annual cycles that structured much of Sumerian urban life. Spring brought the departure of trading expeditions as weather conditions improved and travel became safer. Summer was the season for local markets and craft production, as merchants prepared goods for the next trading season. Fall brought the return of successful expeditions with foreign goods and exotic news. Winter was the time for accounting, planning, and the social activities that maintained the personal relationships essential to commercial success. These trading cycles influenced everything from religious festivals to educational curricula. Temple celebrations were often scheduled to coincide with the departure or return of major trading expeditions. Schools adjusted their schedules to accommodate the sons of merchant families who might travel with their fathers to learn the family business. Even marriage customs were affected, as families planned weddings around trading schedules and sought marriage partners who could strengthen commercial relationships. The impact of climate change on Sumerian trade networks reveals another dimension of their civilization's relationship with the natural environment. The gradual aridification of the Near East during the 3rd millennium BCE forced merchants to adapt their routes and methods as traditional pathways became impassable due to drought or shifting political boundaries. The resilience of Sumerian trading networks in the face of these environmental challenges demonstrates both their practical flexibility and their determination to maintain the international connections that brought prosperity to their cities. Archaeological evidence suggests that some trade routes were abandoned while others were developed to compensate for changing conditions. The famous trade connections with the Indus Valley civilization appear to have declined around 2000 BCE, possibly due to climate-related collapse of that distant culture. At the same time, new trading relationships developed with regions that remained accessible and productive, demonstrating the adaptive capacity that allowed Sumerian commercial culture to survive and influence later civilizations. The technological transfer that occurred through Sumerian trade networks had lasting impacts on global human development. Bronze-working techniques spread from Mesopotamia throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa through the activities of traders who carried not just finished goods but technological knowledge. Agricultural innovations, including improved plough designs and irrigation techniques, diffused along trading routes to benefit farmers thousands of miles from their original development. Perhaps even more important was the spread of intellectual innovations through trading networks. Writing systems, mathematical techniques, astronomical observations, and legal concepts travelled with merchants who served as informal educators and cultural ambassadors. The alphabet itself may have emerged from the practical needs of merchants who required simplified writing systems for international communication. The archaeological investigation of Sumerian craft production reveals another dimension of their technological and artistic achievements. Specialized workshops have been discovered in virtually every major Sumerian city, each focused on particular types of production and organized according to sophisticated principles of efficiency and quality control. Metalworking shops were among the most technically advanced, featuring furnaces capable of reaching temperatures necessary for complex alloy production. Sumerian metallurgists developed techniques for creating bronze objects of extraordinary beauty and precision, from delicate jewellery to massive temple doors. The The famous copper bowls from the foundation deposits of temples demonstrate both technical mastery and artistic vision that influenced metalworking traditions throughout the ancient world. Textile production was equally sophisticated and far more economically important. Sumerian weavers created fabrics of remarkable quality, using techniques that required years to master. The production of fine woolen cloth involved dozens of specialized steps, from sheep breeding and shearing through spinning, dyeing and weaving to finishing and decoration. Each step required specialized knowledge and equipment, creating complex networks of interdependent craftsmen and supporting industries. The organization of craft production reveals important aspects of Sumerian social and economic organization. Most crafts were organized into family-based workshops, where skills were passed from generation to generation. Master craftsmen took apprentices who worked for years before achieving full professional status. Guilds or professional associations provided mutual support, regulated quality standards, and negotiated with political and religious authorities on behalf of their members. But craft production was not entirely traditional or static. Archaeological evidence reveals continuous innovation and experimentation as craftsmen sought to improve their techniques, develop new products, and respond to changing market demands. The evolution of pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and textile designs demonstrates a culture that valued both traditional excellence and creative innovation. The role of craft specialization in Sumerian urbanization cannot be overstated. The concentration of skilled artisans in cities created economic attractions that drew people from rural areas while providing the manufactured goods that supported complex urban life. The efficiency gains from specialization allowed Sumerian society to support larger populations at higher living standards than would have been possible with purely agricultural economies. Competition between craftsmen from different cities drove technological innovation and artistic development. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their most advanced techniques, while also seeking to learn from foreign competitors and collaborators. This competitive environment fostered the rapid development of new technologies and artistic styles that gave Sumerian culture its distinctive character and international influence. The social status of craftsmen in Sumerian society was complex and varied considerably depending on the particular craft, individual skill, and economic circumstances. Some master craftsmen achieved wealth and influence comparable to that of successful merchants or minor nobles. Others remained essentially skilled labourers dependent on wealthy patrons or temple employment for their livelihoods. The archaeological record preserves evidence of craft workshops that operated for generations, suggesting that successful craftsmen established family enterprises that maintained their reputations and client relationships across decades or centuries. The continuity of these workshops provided stability for craftsmen and their families while ensuring the preservation and refinement of traditional techniques. But the craft economy was also subject to disruption from political conflicts, economic downturns, and changing consumer preferences. Archaeological evidence from various Sumerian cities shows periods when craft production declined dramatically, presumably due to warfare, siege, or economic depression. The recovery of craft production after these disruptions required the patient rebuilding of supply chains, training programs, and market relationships. The religious dimensions of craft production reveal another aspect of Sumerian culture that integrated spiritual and practical concerns. Most crafts had patron deities who were believed to inspire and protect skilled workers. Craftsmen made regular offerings to these deities and participated in festivals that celebrated their professions. The blessing of tools, materials, and finished products was considered essential to successful work. Some crafts had explicit religious functions that elevated their practitioners to quasi-priestly status. The production of cult statues, religious vessels, and temple decorations required not just technical skill, but spiritual purity and knowledge of religious symbolism. Craftsmen who specialized in religious work often lived in temple complexes and participated in ritual activities as well as productive labor. The training of craft apprentices reveals important aspects of Sumerian educational philosophy and practice. Unlike formal schooling, which was primarily verbal and literary, craft education was hands-on and experiential. Young people learned through observation, imitation, and gradual assumption of responsibility under the guidance of experienced masters. This educational model produced highly skilled practitioners while also transmitting cultural values and social relationships. The gender dimensions of craft production were complex and varied considerably between different occupations. Some crafts, particularly textile production, were dominated by women who developed sophisticated technical and artistic skills. Other crafts, such as metalworking and stone carving, were primarily male occupations, but there were exceptions and overlaps that challenged simple generalizations about gender roles in ancient societies. Female craft specialists often achieved considerable autonomy and economic independence, particularly when they developed skills that were in high demand. Some women operated their own workshops, employed other workers, and accumulated significant wealth through their productive activities. The legal records of Sumerian cities include numerous contracts and business documents involving female craftsmen, suggesting that their economic contributions were substantial and recognized. The impact of Sumerian craft traditions on later civilizations was enormous and enduring. Techniques developed in Sumerian workshops spread throughout the ancient world and continued to influence production methods for thousands of years. The organization of craft production, the training of apprentices, and the development of professional standards established patterns that persisted in many cultures until the Industrial Revolution. Archaeological investigations of Sumerian agricultural systems reveal innovations and practices that supported some of the world's first urban populations. The development of intensive irrigation agriculture required not just engineering expertise, but sophisticated understanding of soil science, plant breeding, and crop rotation that maximized productivity while maintaining long-term sustainability. The famous irrigation systems of Mesopotamia were not simply collections of canals and dikes, but integrated networks that distributed water according to complex schedules coordinated across multiple communities. The management of these systems required unprecedented levels of cooperation and technical expertise. Watermasters who supervised irrigation operations became some of the most important officials in Sumerian society, responsible for the agricultural productivity that supported entire civilizations. But irrigation agriculture also created environmental problems that eventually contributed to the decline of Sumerian civilization. The accumulation of salt in irrigated soils, caused by the evaporation of irrigation water in the arid Mesopotamian climate, gradually reduced the productivity of agricultural land. Archaeological evidence suggests that crop yields declined significantly during the later Sumerian period, contributing to political instability and social conflict. The Sumerian response to environmental degradation demonstrates both their practical ingenuity and their ultimate limitations in dealing with long-term ecological challenges. Farmers developed salt-tolerant crop varieties and modified their cultivation practices to minimize salinization. Engineers built new canals and drainage systems designed to flush salt from agricultural soils. But these measures were only partially successful, and environmental problems continued to plague Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia. The social organization of Sumerian agriculture reveals complex relationships between large landowners, small farmers, and agricultural laborers that shaped rural life and influenced urban development. Temple estates employed thousands of workers in highly organized agricultural operations that resembled modern industrial farming in their scale and systematic management. Private landowners operated smaller but still substantial farms, using family labor supplemented by seasonal workers and slaves. The seasonal cycles of agricultural work created annual rhythms that structured rural life and influenced urban activities. The flood season required intensive labor to maintain irrigation infrastructure and prepare fields for planting. The growing season involved constant attention to crops, including weeding, pest control, and supplemental irrigation. Harvest time demanded concentrated effort to gather crops quickly before seasonal heat could damage them. These agricultural cycles influenced everything from religious festivals to legal procedures to educational schedules. Courts avoided scheduling important cases during harvest time when rural people were unavailable to serve as witnesses or jurors. Schools adjusted their programs to accommodate students who needed to help with family agricultural activities. Religious ceremonies were often timed to coincide with agricultural seasons, seeking divine support for successful farming and offering thanksgiving for abundant harvests. The development of agricultural surplus was the foundation that made Sumerian urban civilization possible, but the distribution of that surplus was a constant source of social tension and political conflict. Large landowners accumulated wealth and power, that allowed them to influence political decisions and social policies. Small farmers struggled to maintain their independence in the face of debt, taxation, and competition from large estates. Agricultural labourers had little security and few opportunities for advancement. The legal documents preserved in Sumerian archives reveal complex disputes over land ownership, water rights, labour obligations, and crop sharing that reflect the underlying tensions in agricultural society. Some of these disputes were resolved through legal procedures, but others led to violence and social upheaval that contributed to political instability and military conflict. The role of women in Sumerian agriculture was significant, but often overlooked in historical accounts that focused on male landowners and officials. Women participated in all aspects of agricultural work, from field labour to food processing to market activities. Some women owned and operated their own farms, particularly widows who inherited agricultural property from deceased husbands. The seasonal migration of agricultural workers created social and cultural connections between rural and urban areas that influenced the development of Sumerian civilization. Rural people who worked temporarily in cities were exposed to urban technologies, ideas, and social practices that they carried back to their home communities. Urban people who owned rural property or participated in agricultural activities maintained connections with rural life that influenced their perspectives and policies. The integration of agriculture with craft production and trade created economic relationships that connected Sumerian cities with their rural surroundings and with distant trading partners. Agricultural surplus supported urban craft specialization, while manufactured goods and imported commodities were exchanged for agricultural products in complex market networks that linked local and international economies. The religious dimensions of Sumerian agriculture reveal beliefs and practices that integrated spiritual and practical concerns in ways that shaped both farming techniques and social relationships. Agricultural deities were believed to control crop fertility, weather conditions, and pest populations. Farmers made regular offerings to these deities and participated in seasonal festivals that sought divine support for successful farming. The ritual aspects of agricultural work included blessing ceremonies for seeds, tools, and fields, as well as purification rites designed to ensure spiritual as well as physical health of crops and workers. These practices were not merely superstitious, but reflected sophisticated understanding of the psychological and social factors that influenced agricultural productivity and community cooperation. The preservation of agricultural knowledge through oral traditions and written records created educational systems that transmitted farming expertise across generations, while also allowing for innovation and adaptation to changing conditions. Master farmers served as teachers and consultants who shared their knowledge with younger practitioners, while scribes recorded agricultural techniques and observations that could be consulted during unusual circumstances or emergency conditions. The archaeological study of Sumerian urban planning reveals sophisticated understanding of public health, social organization, and aesthetic principles that influenced city development for thousands of years. Sumerian cities were not random collections of buildings, but carefully planned communities designed to support large populations while maintaining social order and cultural values. The layout of major Sumerian cities followed consistent patterns that reflected religious beliefs and practical needs. Temple complexes occupied central locations that made them accessible to all residents, while also demonstrating their importance in community life. Residential areas were organized by social class and occupation, creating neighborhoods with distinctive characteristics and social identities. Public infrastructure in Sumerian cities included paved streets, drainage systems, public squares, and defensive walls that provided essential services, while also creating a sense of civic identity and communal pride. The construction and maintenance of these public works required substantial resources and coordinated effort that demonstrated the organizational capabilities of Sumerian society. The development of standardized building codes and architectural principles created consistency and efficiency in urban construction, while also allowing for individual variation and creative expression. Archaeological excavations reveal building techniques and materials that were used consistently across different cities and time periods, suggesting that Sumerian architects and builders shared common training and professional standards. Water supply and sanitation systems in Sumerian cities were remarkably sophisticated, featuring wells, reservoirs, and drainage channels that provided clean water while removing waste products. These systems required ongoing maintenance and management that created specialized occupations and administrative procedures. The public health benefits of effective sanitation systems contributed to the population growth and urban prosperity that characterized Sumerian civilization. The social geography of Sumerian cities reflected and reinforced social hierarchies, while also providing opportunities for interaction between different social classes. Elite residential areas featured large houses with private courtyards and elaborate decorations, while working-class neighbourhoods had smaller, simpler dwellings, arranged around shared courtyards and common facilities. Commercial districts were organised around marketplaces and craft workshops that created centres of economic activity and social interaction. These areas brought together people from different social backgrounds and occupations, fostering the cultural exchange and innovation that characterised Sumerian urban life. The regulation of commercial activities through official oversight and legal procedures ensured fair dealing while also generating revenue for city governments. The defensive architecture of Sumerian cities reveals both their military capabilities and their vulnerability to external threats. Massive walls surrounded most major cities, with gates that could be sealed during emergencies, and towers that provided observation points and defensive positions. The construction of these fortifications required enormous resources and demonstrated the serious nature of military threats faced by Sumerian communities. But city walls were not merely defensive structures. They also served as symbols of civic identity and sources of community pride. The famous walls of Uruk, attributed to the hero Gilgamesh, were celebrated in literature and served as models for other cities. The maintenance and decoration of city walls became expressions of civic values and artistic achievement, as well as practical necessities. The preservation of urban archaeological sites has provided unprecedented insight into daily life in ancient cities. The excavation of residential areas, workshops, temples, and public buildings has revealed details about domestic architecture, family life, work practices, and social relationships that complement information from written sources. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine and sometimes revolutionize our understanding of Sumerian urban life. Recent excavations have revealed sophisticated waste management systems, evidence of urban gardens and food production, and complex networks of underground storage facilities that supported urban populations during emergencies or periods of scarcity. The influence of Sumerian urban planning principles on later city development was enormous and enduring. The basic layout of cities around central religious or civic complexes, the organisation of residential areas by social class, and the integration of commercial, residential and public spaces established patterns that influenced urban development throughout history. The study of Sumerian religious architecture reveals beliefs and practices that shaped both spiritual life and social organisation. Temple complexes were not simply buildings, but cosmic symbols that represented the meeting place between earthly and divine realms. The construction of these monuments required enormous resources and demonstrated community commitment to maintaining proper relationships with the gods. The evolution of temple architecture over time reflects changing religious beliefs and practices, as well as technological innovations and artistic developments. Early temples were relatively simple structures built on raised platforms, but later temples became elaborate complexes with multiple buildings, courtyards, and specialized facilities for different religious functions. The famous ziggurats that dominated Sumerian cities were architectural marvels that represented some of humanity's most ambitious construction projects. These stepped towers, rising as high as modern 10-story buildings, required advanced engineering techniques and massive labour forces to construct. The ziggurat of Ur, still partially standing today, demonstrates the technical and artistic achievements of Sumerian architects and builders. But ziggurats were more than impressive buildings. They were religious symbols that connected earthly communities with divine powers. The temples at their summits were believed to be actual dwelling places of the gods, while the towers themselves represented sacred mountains where heaven and earth met. The ritual processions that climbed these towers were spiritual journeys that transformed participants and reinforced community religious identity. The decoration of temple buildings reveals sophisticated artistic traditions and symbolic systems that conveyed religious messages while also demonstrating cultural values and aesthetic principles. Wall reliefs, mosaic decorations, and sculptural elements created environments that enhanced religious experience while also serving educational functions for largely illiterate populations. The archaeological investigation of temple complexes has revealed evidence of activities beyond religious worship, including economic management, legal proceedings, and educational programs. Temples served as community centres that provided services and coordinated activities essential to urban life. The integration of religious and secular functions reflects the holistic worldview that characterised Sumerian culture. The preservation and restoration of Sumerian religious monuments has created ongoing challenges and opportunities for archaeological research. Many sites have been damaged by warfare, looting, and environmental degradation, but conservation efforts have also revealed new information about construction techniques, artistic traditions, and religious practices. The global significance of Sumerian religious architecture extends beyond its historical importance to its influence on contemporary understanding of human spiritual needs and cultural expression. The design principles and symbolic systems developed in Sumerian temples influenced religious architecture throughout the ancient world and continue to inspire contemporary architects and religious communities. As our long journey through Sumerian civilization draws toward its close, we find ourselves contemplating a legacy that extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Mesopotamia or the temporal limits of the Bronze Age. The innovations, insights, and institutions created by the Sumerians became the foundation stones upon which all subsequent civilizations were built, creating patterns of human organization that persist to this day. The Sumerian achievement was not simply the creation of the first cities or the invention of writing, though these accomplishments were remarkable enough. It was rather the demonstration that human beings could transcend the limitations imposed by nature, kinship, and tradition to create new forms of social organization based on cooperation, specialization, and conscious planning. They proved that civilization was possible, that people could live together in large numbers while maintaining both individual dignity and collective prosperity. This fundamental insight, that human societies could be deliberately designed and continuously improved, became the driving force behind all subsequent human development. Every democracy that has ever been established, every legal system that has ever been codified, every educational institution that has ever been founded, every technological innovation that has ever been developed, builds upon the Sumerian recognition that human beings are not prisoners of circumstance, but active creators of their own destiny. The specific institutions and practices developed by the Sumerians, their laws and governments, their schools and temples, their markets and workshops, their arts and literatures, were adapted, modified, and transformed by later civilizations according to their particular needs and circumstances. But the underlying principles that guided Sumerian innovation, the belief in human potential, the commitment to social cooperation, the pursuit of knowledge and beauty, proved to be universal human values that transcended cultural boundaries and historical periods. The challenges faced by Sumerian civilization, environmental degradation, social inequality, political conflict, technological disruption, were not unique to their time and place but represent permanent features of the human condition that every civilization must address. Their responses to these challenges were not always successful, but they pioneered approaches to problem-solving that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about sustainability, justice, governance, and progress. Perhaps most importantly, the Sumerians demonstrated that civilization is not a destination but a process, not a final achievement but an ongoing experiment in human possibility. Their cities rose and fell, their empires expanded and contracted, their technologies advanced and sometimes regressed, but their fundamental contribution, the idea that human beings can consciously shape their world to promote flourishing and prevent suffering, survived every political catastrophe and cultural transformation. The archaeological rediscovery of Sumerian civilization in the 19th and 20th centuries came at a time when humanity needed reminding of its creative potential and historical depth. The Industrial Revolution had created new possibilities for human cooperation and technological advance, but it had also generated unprecedented social disruption and environmental challenges. The study of Sumerian achievements provided both inspiration and perspective for people grappling with the opportunities and dangers of rapid change. Today, as we face global challenges that require unprecedented levels of international cooperation and technological innovation, the Sumerian example remains relevant and instructive. Their success in creating functional institutions from nothing their ability to balance individual initiative with collective responsibility, and their commitment to preserving and transmitting cultural achievements across generations offer models for contemporary efforts to build a more just and sustainable world. The story of Sumerian civilization is ultimately a story about human potential, about what becomes possible when people refuse to accept the limitations imposed by circumstances and instead choose to imagine and work toward better possibilities. It is a reminder that every great human achievement began as someone's impossible dream, that every institution we now take for granted was once an untested experiment, and that every generation has the opportunity and responsibility to contribute to the ongoing human project of creating meaning from chaos and beauty, from the raw materials of existence. In the quiet hours when time seems suspended and the modern world fades into memory, we can still sense the presence of those ancient dreamers and builders who first dared to imagine that humans could be more than they had ever been before. Their voices echo across the millennia, speaking of courage and creativity, of hope and determination, of the endless human capacity to transform vision into reality. They remind us that we too are part of their great experiment, that we too have the power to shape our world according to our highest aspirations, that we too can leave behind achievements that will inspire and guide future generations long after we ourselves have joined the ranks of honoured ancestors. The rivers still flow through the lands where they built their first cities, carrying forward the endless stream of human possibility. The stars still wheel overhead in patterns they learned to read and interpret, marking the passage of time that connects their dreams to ours. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, in the space between sleeping and waking, their ancient wisdom lives on, waiting to inspire the next chapter in humanity's long story of becoming. The dawn of civilization began in the marshes of Mesopotamia 5 millennia ago, but it has never ended. It continues in every act of human creativity, in every moment of cooperation across difference, in every choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to hope rather than despair. We are all heirs to Sumer, all citizens of that first great experiment in human possibility, all participants in the ongoing effort to create a world worthy of our highest dreams. Time flows on, patient and eternal, carrying all things toward an unknown future. But the light first kindled in Sumerian cities burns as bright as ever, a torch passed from hand to hand across the centuries, a flame that will never be extinguished as long as human hearts dare to dream of better tomorrows, and human hands reach out to make those dreams real.